Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tim Kawahara. I'm the Executive Director of the UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate. We're a joint research center of the Business School, Anderson, and the Law School as well. I'd like to welcome everybody here for braving the rain. It was actually pouring when I was walking over here from Anderson. And I understand there's some live streaming as well. So for those of you that are watching it from elsewhere or your smartphones, welcome and glad you could participate in today's lecture. This is the very, very first event in what we're calling UCLA Housing, Neighborhood, and Health series. The series is a joint endeavor between the Ziman Center Housing and Healthcare Initiative, the UCLA Center for Neighborhood Knowledge, which is Professor Ong's center, the UCLA Center for Health Policy Research at the Fielding School of Public Health, and the UCLA Center for Occupational Environmental Health, which is also at Fielding. So I'd like to thank Luskin School for hosting us today and for, I think, providing the food for this event as well. So thank you very much. My understanding is that this series will actually rotate between the various schools and departments that make up this particular lecture. So we'll move it around campus to make it interesting. The title of today's presentation is Beyond Zip Codes, Unpacking Place Health Inequity Through the Lens of the Urban Spatial Structure. Sounds very academic. And a short summary, this talk will explore the underlying causal paths that link place characteristics, location accessibility, and transportation resources to health outcomes and systematic disparities, of which we obviously know there are many. Are most of you Luskin students? Should I go into a deep dive in your bio, Paul? Or? Okay. What can I tell you? He's terrific. Obviously very well-known professor, deep in his field. I will say that we have a long affiliation with Professor Ong at the Ziman Center. We're extremely pleased that he's been one of our faculty research fellows for at least 10 or more years, I think. So, and a lot of good work has come out of it. Many of his studies we've been able to push out in the media and got lots of attention on rent and all sorts of other issues that are really pertinent to Los Angeles and the region for sure. And he reminded me that today's lecture is very interesting and that public health and the built environment and urban planning actually were very connected disciplines. And in fact, when you think about the great cities of the world, many of them were designed around health issues, whether it be how to incorporate a sewage system. You think about London and some of the other places. So at some point, these fields sort of diverged a little bit, but I think our efforts to try to bring them back together, that all of these things are connected. And that's what we're hoping to do through this particular lecture series, is find the touch points and that connectivity there. So with that, I guess I'll simply introduce my colleague and good friend, Professor Paul Ong. Thank you.
Okay, I want to repeat what Tim said. Thank you for coming out on this gloomy day. I'm not sure if my talk's gonna make it any brighter, because I'm gonna touch on some maybe not so bright topics. I also want to make sure I want to thank the Ziman Center, Christine, the CNK staff, and the others who made this talk possible. This talk draws on our current work, our future work, as well as work done by many of my colleagues, some of whom will be also giving lectures as part of this series. I'm taking this from the perspective as an urbanist trained in economics. So I want to apologize upfront to my public health colleagues and friends for any faux pas in terms of my deep lack of knowledge in that field. But hopefully I can make a contribution. So I want to try to go through this fast, if I don't get off on a tangent, which I quite often do. But I want to go for fast so we can have some discussion. I want to start off by saying that we all instinctively have a feeling that the neighborhood we live in defines us. It defines in terms of what we do, how we play. It gives us identity. And so it's fundamental in terms of our lived experience. And let me just give you a sense of the incredible diversity of neighborhoods by talking about my field work in San Francisco last year, where I was gentrification in the neighborhood that my colleague Karen Chappell at Berkeley says is one of the most gentrified neighborhoods in the Bay Area. So I had a chance to look at it firsthand. The problem living in a gentrified neighborhood is that it's not cheap, but it's sort of incredibly interesting. And when I go to a city, I love trying to discover the city by going around, taking public transit or walking. So let me give you a quick tour of San Francisco. So I lived in this area right here, the north side of Poco. And so if I go north, and I could do this by taking public transportation, the cable car was actually only 1 block from where I live. And you know, it's a tourist trap, but it's also local residents really use it to get around. And you can tell that because, you know, you get to know the drivers, they get to know you, they talk to you. So you could take a cable car to go up to the, what we call the marina. And going up in that direction, you know, you get a feeling of super affluence. And so by the time you get up to the marina, you could see what the neighborhood looks like in the second picture. Multi-million-dollar homes fronting the water. You know, it's a place that I wouldn't mind living, except for my salary won't support it. So that's going north. But sometimes I get a craving. I get a craving for char siu bao. One of my field studies in San Francisco was I had a list of 24 dim sum places throughout the city. And I have a notebook where I recorded the price, you know, the quality, the taste, my impression of it. Yeah, legitimate field work, so I could write it off. But yeah, Chinatown has a couple of good places still. Although it's not really the heart of the Chinese community anymore. It's dispersed into the Sunset District, dispersed into the Richmond District to the west. But to get there from where I am, you know, it's not that easy. You either have to go over the hill, or you could take this dark tunnel, you know, that divides Pocosh from Chinatown. And it's symbolic about the distance, not necessarily physical, but other sorts of barriers between communities. But anyway, you walk through the tunnel, and the first thing you do is you get out in Chinatown. And let me give you a bit of advice. Don't go to Grant Street. That's where all the tourists go. That's what we call the front stage. You know, go to the back stage. Go to Stockton Street. And that's a picture of Stockton Street. That's where the locals and Chinese go to shop, to eat, and so forth. So a very different neighborhood. The people are different. The environment's different. Other aspects of it's very different than that first picture you saw of the marina. So that's going west of where I live. So if I go south, we head towards, okay, I go south for 2 reasons from where I live. One is to go to the public library. And San Francisco has this amazing public library with historical collections that I was using. So I used to go there about at least once a week, or not more. Or I walked down that way to go catch the BART so I could go across to Berkeley, where I was a visiting scholar over there. But to get there from where I lived to BART or to the library, you go through the Tenderloin. So if you don't know the Tenderloin, it has the highest concentration of homelessness in the Bay Area, a product of the growing inequality and gentrification and displacement that occurs in San Francisco. And so you could see the 2 pictures. The first one is just walking down Polk Street. That's my usual path in terms of walking down. And the bottom one is the entrance to BART. Again, a very different neighborhood than the previous 2. Very distinctively different. And so one of the insights and it's somewhat of a cliche that our friends in public health come up with, is that these places matters. And the idea that matters is that your zip code is more predictive of your health than your DNA. So that's a great saying. It sort of summarizes much. And I gave you the zip codes for the 3 neighborhoods I showed and the diversity. And then, you know, Los Angeles has its own neighborhoods. The most famous is that last one, including a TV show by that name. So again, you know, we instinctively know, or we learn from the media, it's different heterogeneity among neighborhoods, and they have real meaning. And so one of the meanings, particularly in health, is that there are spatial variations in health outcomes. And you can see this by looking at the 2 maps here in terms of life expectancy. The one on the left represents life expectancy, average life expectancy by counties in the US. And again, you see enormous differences in terms of the lifespan, expected lifespan. 10, 15 years. I mean, that's not insignificant. For those of us who are getting older, you know, those 10, 15 years are huge. Not so much for you younger folks. But what's interesting is that it's not just a national issue about the spatial variation. We see the same thing within regions, across neighborhoods. And that's represented by this map on this side. And in some ways, the variations are probably as great, if not greater, than the national variation across counties. One actually has to be a little careful about the data, because when you get into a small geographic area, you know, you're subject to much more error. But there's no question is that within regions, we see the same sort of huge, enormous spatial variation in terms of health outcome as we look in terms of average life expectancy. But it's not just life expectancy. It's also other health outcomes, morbidity rates. And this is morbidity rates across neighborhoods or census tracts here in Los Angeles County. And what you see is normalized spread. So I already showed you the life expectancy, so we normalize it to the average, the median. And so there is a spread there. But if you look at some of the other health indicators, there's also huge spreads depending on which neighborhood you live in terms of the health outcome. And I think that's at the core of the concept that your zip code is very predictive in terms of your health status. And if we look at this, you know, we look at the 4 I looked at, life expectancy, asthma rates, low weight birth or low birth weight, and cardiovascular disease, that spatially they're correlated with each other. Again, not surprising. And these are just the correlation numbers there. Sometimes, you know, as academics, you say, well, those are the correlations, those are the R's, statistically significant at the, you know, P less than the P.001 level. All of them are less than that. So what? Sometimes we get a better sense visually. I mean, I encourage my students, and that's why we teach GIS, particularly because of our interest in spatial aspect. Visually, you can see the relationships better. And also, since you throw a map up, you know, one of the things that people do is that they actually connect with it. Because one of the things they do is, where's my neighborhood? You know, what is my life expectancy? You know, depending where I live. But what you see is that this maps out the top quintile and the bottom quintile in terms of the health indicators that we have. And so you can visually see that by and large, there are these spatial correlations with sort of a heavy concentration in the inner city. So that's the sort of spatial correlation that we know. But what we want to do is start explaining some of these outcomes and understanding it. And I draw from the work that's done in public health, particularly the concept of the social determinants of health. And up there you have the World Health Organization definition of what that means. Essentially, all it means is that our outcome is structured by larger dynamics, larger factors that shapes our lives. It is also shaped by the context within which we reside, we work, and we play. And those are powerful. Those things explain huge amount of the differences in health outcomes. And so I'm going to give you two examples of how health outcomes vary with basic demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. One is in terms of life expectancy by race. And there you see large variations across the major racial groups, both in the US and in California. And there's also a relationship between your class and the health outcomes. And you can see that nationally. That is, if you go up vertically for any year, you could see that the life expectancy of those who are the most affluent is considerably higher than those with the least amount of financial resources. And here we see in Los Angeles a different, this is from a different source, we also see that sort of relationship if we measure it as economic hardship. Economic hardship, essentially, you're in poverty or you have low income, it's hard to cover things. And that has a correlation with life expectancy also. So the World Health Organization definition sort of alludes to, but really does not touch directly on what we call spatiality. And I use that term from I learned that term from my former colleague who passed away recently, Ed Soja. Ed is very different from me. He became a postmodern scholar. And I have a real hard time reading his and other postmodern scholarship. But there's no question that he drummed into my mind, and I hear that voice, space matters. You know, whatever you do, space matters. And the concept of spatiality as an element of the social determinant of health is what we're here about today. And so spatiality of the social determinants of health. The way we start is I draw from a framework that my colleague Sylvia Gonzalez is over there. You want to raise your hand? And so it's a way that we try to understand what we mean by the spatial structure. And the spatial structure is both a result of and a contributing factor to outcomes. That is, they have this sort of simultaneity. That is, you know, we produce the urban structure as a society, as people. But that structure itself also feeds back in a meaningful, independent way in defining our outcomes as people. And that the social construction, the societal construction of the geographic configuration, distribution of people, activities, and resources is one key element. Another one is the connection or isolation by physical, informational, socioeconomic networks. And those things can facilitate or hinder interactions. And finally, a key element is the effects that comes from spillovers and externalities. That's not accounted for in the first two characteristics. And what we see is a very complex system, an interlocking complex system. And sometimes I get overwhelmed by trying to understand that. And quite often I end up going, and my staff knows this term, down the rabbit hole, because I get lost in that complex system. And once in a while I'll come back out, maybe with some new insights. Okay, so here, you know, we begin seeing a very simplistic way of thinking about the correlation between social determinants and health outcomes across neighborhoods here in Los Angeles. And this is the relationship, for example, the poverty rate of a neighborhood and the 4 key health indicators we looked at earlier. I, I have mixed feelings about talking about this or not. Okay, so if you notice the correlations, they're not one. It doesn't, if you go back to the previous one, it's not one. The R is not one. That means it's not mapped one-to-one. And that's because cities are very complex. The way that they're organized, they cluster with each other are very different. So this is from a study I did with 2 colleagues. And essentially, we looked at here in Los Angeles, throwing in as many of the factors as associated with the World Health Organization, plus our own concern about urban structure. It's, in terms of looking at how neighborhoods are clustered by characteristics. So each of these rows represent a type of clustering of characteristics by neighborhoods. So there's one type of clustering that occurs that has high Hispanic proportion, high proportion children, and low education. But what's interesting is that this clustering also occurs not just across population and our traditional demographic socioeconomic characteristics, they also cluster around some other economic outcomes, housing. They also cluster around externalities and so forth. And so we have this sort of complex matrix of neighborhoods. Clearly different neighborhoods. Clearly there are clusterings of it. Clearly it's complex. And one of the ways we try to, again, simplify this is to think about what we consider the 3 major elements that can affect health outcomes. One is the housing segregation and place stratification. So the second one is the land use transportation way that affects accessibility, particularly beyond your neighborhood. And the third one is the distribution of localized hazards, those that spills over into the area you reside in. Again, this is a way for us to conceptually think about a framework that guides our analytical work. Place, okay, so we know that cities are segregated, and if you read the literature, you know, it's a combination of market forces, public policy, particularly zoning, and what we call social or economic sorting that occurs. And here's 2 quick maps that sort of shows you the patterns in Los Angeles. This one shows you the most affluent area versus the poorest area. The ones on the right are areas that are a majority of one of the major racial groups. And so this is the pattern that we see in terms of that segregation and stratification. And then there's no question that one way to understand the health outcome is what we call a compositional effect. And that's a very simple notion. You know, a poor neighborhood is poor because it has poor people. You know, it's, you know, a Asian neighborhood enclave is an Asian enclave because it has Asian people. It's a compositional effect. And being, as you saw earlier, you know, being Asian or being poor carries with it certain health risks. So all you're seeing at some level is that, you know, we pull people together, forced them together, segregated them, and created these stratified neighborhoods. And because who lives there, the composition, we see some of that health outcome differences. But it's not just the sum of people, and that's what our research is trying to get at. That is that places also matter in different ways. Places are sites for the allocation of resources and opportunity. For example, where healthy food outlets are, as well as alcohol outlets and open space. Places also generate what we call social capital, both in a positive and negative way. And even if you want to think about you know, the positive side, even in disadvantaged neighborhoods, the asset mapping, and I agree with that, there are positive assets. It's not that it's lacking positive assets. The question is that the assets in terms of levels, quality and quantity, and its effectiveness varies. So you could have assets, but in a competitive market, in our economy, in our society, if a neighborhood has twice as much assets, they have a leg up in terms of what happens. The land use transportation accessibility. So physical accessibility is defined both by the geographic distances as well as transportation capability. So let me talk a little bit about this in terms of employment. And this is work I've done earlier with my colleagues Brian Taylor and Evie Blumenberg. Essentially, like I said, cities are essentially structured. And one of the ways we structure it is we place jobs and business activities in one location, residents in another place. That creates a system where there's different concentration of jobs versus where people live. And so this is Los Angeles. So you recognize it. So we have still remnants of the aerospace industry down here around Manhattan Beach in that area. We have we still have a garden district. That's a manufacturing through here. We have the port complex here. We have the Great Wilshire Corridor. Somewhat unique to Los Angeles that you don't find as much in other areas. You find the other major leg in terms of the economy, entertainment, both film and otherwise. So here's Universal Studio that represents. So this is the pattern of jobs. This is an example, can you reach these jobs? And what happens is it's from this location right here, somewhere in South Los Angeles. I hate to tell you how I did this because I didn't do it. So I had some interns. So I had them go on Google Maps and they put in different addresses until they found by transit 30 minutes away. By transit. Then they did the same thing to find 30 minutes by car. And then we mapped it. I love interns. And it's amazing the difference, the huge difference in terms of coverage by transit versus auto.
Can I just ask you what year this was created?
It was created 2 summers ago.
Okay.
Yes.
There's a lot of new public transit.
There's new public transit.
Jobs are moving all over the place.
Jobs are moving all over the place. Although it's actually we've been tracking the job concentrations. And yes, there's movements, but not as much as you think. The core of it sort of remains. Public transit has made a difference, but not a huge difference. So I agree with you, but I'm not sure if it changes the analysis of this. So it's not just jobs in terms of the land use, transportation, accessibility, but we also see the same issues in terms of access to healthcare. And I'll talk a little bit more about it a little bit later. In this city, and in every other city other than San Francisco and New York we're really talking about Manhattan, because if you're out in Queens, you can't get to Brooklyn without going through Manhattan. Other than those 2 areas, we're car dependent. Car makes a difference. And so, unfortunately, car ownership, automobile ownership is shaped by other factors, including class, race, by the markets and political factors. I'll get to an example of that later. The other one that's emerging is the sort of interest in what we call active transport, both in health and in urban planning. Active transport just means you stop using some mechanized motor. You walk, you ride your bike, I don't know what else you could do, but it's part of active transportation. I'm not sure that's active. I'm still up in the air about that. We can debate it. So that was the second component, the land use, transportation, accessibility dimension. The other one is the externalities and hazards. That is, disadvantaged communities are much more exposed to higher levels of mobile and stationary sources of air pollution. And that, I will go, vehicle accidents, traffic accidents, more prevalent in minority communities. And that's not surprising. Okay, so this is taken from a study that I did with several of my colleagues down here. So Doug Howson will be coming to talk. So he's one of the speakers in this area. Jun Wu will also be coming to talk about their research. But this is research we did here in Los Angeles. And one of the things we wanted to look at is the role of traffic density and mobile sources of air pollution in terms of its impact on different neighborhoods and different populations. And so this is just a map of the density of traffic here in Los Angeles. It's kind of hard to see, but there are different gradations of it. So what is amazing? Okay, so we do know that higher traffic density increases pollution, mobile sources, particularly particulate matters. There's that wicked stuff that gets into your lungs and never leaves and has damages. But it also is associated with accidents, and actually that's our future research. But here's the interesting thing, and this is why it's somewhat of an externality, is if you look at traffic density and you compare that to the vehicle miles traveled generated by that neighborhood, what you see, so if it's greater than 1, it means that there's more traffic there than being generated locally. So what you see, actually this it's not been completely normalized, is that poor areas, particularly very poor areas, are suffering much more from traffic that's coming through. It's not, accidents are higher there, but it's not just because, the traffic that's domestic in terms of neighborhood. And it's sort of, the difference is sort of amazing. So if you look at across these 3 categories of neighborhoods, this one, the bar goes well beyond here, goes up to 2.9 in terms of that index. So externalities in terms of pollution, in terms of accidents. And we also know that when these things happen, that governments are less responsive to the concerns of disadvantaged neighborhoods. A quick example is the excitement plant in East Los Angeles, the battery, the lead exposure, versus what happened in Southern Cal gas release in terms of Porter Ranch. Completely different. I mean, we knew about the problems of the batteries for years. And state agencies, local agencies failed, in my opinion, to be responsive. And that's very different from what we saw after the release of gas in Porter Ranch. And even though, again, think about externalities and benefits that's created, that I am very much, we're moving towards more sustainable ways of thinking about development. The state here in California, we've been in the lead in terms of trying to move towards sustainability. And one of it, for example, is to promote transit-oriented development. But the problem with that is quite often the improvements we make leaks out. It does not go to those who are most marginalized. So let's move from correlation to causality. As I pretty much talked about the correlation that we've seen between the health outcomes and the urban spatial structure. But we need to actually, because to be impactful, we need to know what causes what. And for us here in the Luskin School, we particularly want to know what's the contribution to urban spatial structure in terms of these outcomes. So it's a way for us to try to analyze quantitatively, empirically, the contribution of both individual characteristics as well as neighborhood characteristics that leads to these outcomes. And I have a particular interest in race and ethnicity, so that's why you see it up there. But there are other forms of inequality that I acknowledge. Again, my interest is around race and ethnicity. And this is conceptually how we do it, and the way we implement it is that we use multi-level econometric modeling that looks at both individual and contextual variables. And one of the tricky things is in a complex system, there's all sorts of endogeneities, things flow back and forth. It's hard to solve. Okay, this was our final result of about 2 decades plus of research. when we first introduced the idea that both transportation and land use affects employment outcome. Yeah, we built certainly on John Kane's work on spatial mismatch, but we said it's much more complex. It also includes your ability to reach jobs, not just where jobs are located. And so, this is much of the original research and what people still do today. But the problem is that this and this are simultaneously determined. If you have a car, you have a better chance of finding a job and holding a job. But if you have a job, you have a better chance of having a vehicle. That's what we call endogeneity, simultaneity. And it took us a long time to get to assembling the information and so forth to create what we call an instrumental variable, or a way of accounting for and taking away the feedback. And so one of the things we discover is that what influences, clearly your income influences, your education influences, but there are neighborhood geographic variables that influence it, that are independent of these things. So for example, transit access helps, but it also gets washed away a little bit, because the closer you are to transit, the higher your rents will be. And most people we're talking about are renters. And so you have some gains from that helps, but it gets washed away. And again, that's the complexity of our urban structure and how markets work. Insurance. Okay, so work done with my colleague Michael Stoll here. For the same car, for the same driver, the same coverage, if you live in one zip code versus another, your premium could be twice as high. And the insurance company always argue it's because they're in neighborhoods with greater risk. So the work Michael and I did was actually incorporate accident rates, claim rates, and so forth. And sure enough, those things are important. But it didn't wash away the fact that disadvantaged neighborhoods still face higher premiums. Insurance company, you gotta love them, right? So when we did this research and we presented it, and it was used by the insurance commissioner, in re-looking at insurance thing, they came to us and said, we want to work with you because we think we can give you more data that'll be helpful for your analysis and it'll improve our claim. And we said, wait, well, great, we'll work with you and so forth. As soon as the commissioner made a decision, which was they will allow some moderate use of area-based premium setting. As soon as that happened, we never heard back from the insurance company. They weren't willing to share data with us and so forth. But even then, I worked a little bit with ProPublica in a recent study that again revisited the insurance variations. And we still see disadvantaged neighborhoods, even with the same coverage, paying higher rates. And then finally, policing. How we regulate makes a difference. And this idea actually came out of Ferguson. So one of the things that happened in Ferguson was they discovered that local government was being funded in part by traffic tickets, with traffic tickets being overly concentrated in minority, low-income areas. And so, surprise, it happens here in California too. So we worked with the Legal Aid Society, which through their legal powers, so forth, we able to get data. It's sort of amazing, the maldistribution of traffic enforcement fines and consequence of losing your license if you can't pay your fine across neighborhoods. And all of those things affect your transportation resource. It's not just because you're poor. It's also because you live in certain types of neighborhood. Oh, I forgot financing. The premium, the interest rate you pay varies, not surprisingly, very systematic. So we want to take this sort of approach that we apply to job mismatch to the health area, look at health as the outcome, whereas this work looked at employment. Again, it took us over 20 years to do the job stuff. So we're at the beginning, we're probably 2 or 3 years into the health stuff. So maybe in 18 years, you guys could come back and I could report some real concrete results. Okay, but we are starting some preliminary ones. One is that I worked with, again, the colleagues that I previously mentioned down here. We started doing some simple ecological regressions. It's a starting point for us. So what's amazing, the dependent variable is the asthma rate in neighborhoods. So what is amazingly interesting, it's not surprising, diesel PM, particulate matter. Higher that level, the higher the asthma rate. Temperature matters, because if you know people with asthma, weather matters. It affects the outcome. Access to primary care, even though we can't link individuals to individual providers, what we find is that in neighborhoods that have many more resources in terms of primary health care, we associate that with lower asthma rates. And clearly, the socioeconomic and demographic variables also matter. The problem with this is this is an ecological model with all sorts of problems with it that we acknowledge. We still think it's useful. So it helps us understand patterns. And then sometimes you don't have the data, you can't do much more. But there's some good news. So moving to multi-level analysis. So this is from work done by DM Tran. She's also going to be a speaker. So I'll come hear her too. So, and so she does a multivariate analysis where there's all this extensive set of individual characteristics that the literature tells we ought to account for. DM also is a proud product of Luskin and as well as the Feeding School of Public Health. So she has 1 foot there, 1 foot there, which is a great combination in terms of the type of work we're talking about. So, and here are her neighborhood types. Her research is basic question: does neighborhood change in the form of gentrification place more stress on people, and it's manifested in higher rates of reported mental health illnesses? And using microdata from CHIS, the California Health Interview Survey, merged with contextual variables, these variables are actually constructed by a separate set of ecological regressions to try to identify the types of neighborhoods. So this is the type of research that we're trying to move towards. That, again, thinking back at our conceptual empirical model, is that we want to account for both individual level as well as contextual variables and understanding outcomes. And I should also mention, we look at diseases. My colleague and friend, Deirdre Pfeiffer over there, she's visiting from ASU. She's going to also be giving a talk, but she's going to talk about housing, urban structure, and happiness. So hopefully a more positive spin on that. Okay, so essentially I ran through what we know, what the challenges are for us, our future research. But the reason we're doing that is that we do believe in knowledge linked to action. And that empirical understanding does several things. It identifies points of intervention, and particularly what we call upstream. That is before the health outcomes. What are the factors that contribute to it, particularly urban structure? So we're going to identify interventions. We are certainly tracing and quantifying potential treatment impacts, attacking fundamental spatial causes. I mentioned that. It's well and good to think about how we do the empirical research. We also need to think about a normative framework by which we evaluate and judge this. And this is very tricky. Are we talking about distributional justice? That is, everybody should be entitled to some minimal material goods. Do we talk about procedural fairness, that our institutions in the state operate in a neutral way that's fair? Are we talking about fundamental capabilities? That is, these are capabilities that all humans should have in order to, if they choose to use it, have a fulfilling life. Or we're talking about the absence of oppression. So each of these come from different philosophers in terms of it. And translating those into a set of standards that we can interpret our interpret work itself is challenging. If you read heavily into the raw paradigm and the people who use him, yeah, he doesn't talk about the absence of oppression, which Irish Young talks about. That we live in a real society that, depending on who you are, you face different types of oppression. So each of these frameworks are important to understand, and we need to think through how do we make judgment calls. We need to make judgment calls about what's good and what's bad. The good news is there's some real world applications happening right now that's related to what I've talked about that could have an impact on health. HUD's affirmatively furthering fair housing and the Moving to Opportunities program. It's been, almost a century since we outlaw racial zoning and restrictive covenants, but we're still fighting for fair housing. How far we go with that, I don't know, particularly with this administration. But the good news in terms of guiding our work is that the current wave of analysis moving to opportunities, that's the effort to assign people to different types of vouchers in different locations. That even though the short-term effects seem to be minimal, if any, the long-term effect over a lifetime seems to be very positive, particularly for younger children who move. We have the Department of Education's Promise Zones built on the experiment in Harlem, which is, one of the fundamental forces that create inequality over generation is unequal education. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. Where are we today? It's in some ways it's somewhat sad, but I'm still happy that we're at least trying to address that. And so that's trying to build communities around quality education. There's the California endowments building healthy communities. And the good thing about them is that they actively link a broad concept of health to neighborhood viability, including issues such as gentrification. Metro now has an affordable transit connected housing program. I think this partly came from political heat on them. That actually, if you look at how they operated before, they say, we go throw in the benefits and we let the market allocate who gets it. And so now they have a program around putting affordable housing. There's California Environmental Justice program that comes out of the climate change initiative, particularly the allocation of cap and trade. A little more locally, there's Air Quality Management District's effort around environmental justice incentive, such as providing incentives for dry cleaners in minority disadvantaged area to transition out of PERC. PERC is that old chemical that has all sorts of nasty effects on people. So there are things that are being done, and I'm very grateful for that. But one thing I want people to think about, encourage people to do, is that these are great efforts, but we don't know if they're effective or not. We don't know the outcomes. We don't know whether the agencies are just providing lip service or not. And so I could give you a good example. This one I've evaluated. Made no difference. And the way the agency did is, we gave up so many grants, so it must have a positive effect. But the real thing is that would they have otherwise converted? And the ones who didn't convert, did they stay out? And after you, dry cleaners. Yeah. No. We don't know about the Metro one. We do know that they have conceded some of this. I want to believe the best in people, that they really want to do it. I also know the history of forcing them to do it. Okay, so you pick and choose. But what I do encourage us to do as researchers and as practitioners is to look at these things as hopeful, but with a skeptical eye. there must be, and there hopefully will be, people who monitor, evaluate these things in order both to help them do a better job, but when they're not doing a good job, hold them accountable. And I think that's our contribution. It's a contribution that we have to work with other community groups, with other stakeholders in terms of ensuring a better, healthier world that's more just and equitable. Thank you. Tim, do we have any time for a couple quick questions, or do we have to go?
I think there's a class of 2.
2, okay. Okay. Yes, Vicky?
Thank you for a great talk. My name is Vicky. I want to ask a question because.
You want to introduce yourself? I'm not sure if everybody knows.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Professor Vicky Mace. I'm in the School of Public Health as well as in the Department of Psychology. And I've worked with all these folks. One of the things that you talk about is this notion of residential segregation. And one of the things that I think some of the new research is starting to question what the sociologists have told us before. That just because you have a cluster of individuals of a particular racial group, and even if they're poor, that it's a bad place to live. And some of us have been trying to talk about the difference between that and, kind of ethnic enclaves. But we've also been trying to say, because you're poor isn't the worst, living situation versus what's starting to come out is that in higher income African American Latino males, they have high incomes, having terrible life expectancy rates drop because the stress of exposure to these predominantly white, jobs and neighborhoods and the taxes that go with that are really eroding their health. So can you kind of say where you fall in terms of those two?
Well, where I fall is I fully agree with you, and you got it perfectly right. It is complex. We use the term minority area, low-income area, and we attribute the average to it. But there is huge, even within those categories, there are huge variations that we are trying to understand. Why in an equally poor neighborhood, some outcomes are better than others. Yeah, and I think, part of it is we do it through our modeling, but part of it is that it's probably things well beyond our modeling that we don't fully understand. And that's why I'm inviting you in January to meet with us to advise us. Yeah, the best thing you do is you have to call out your critics at the very beginning. No, but I fully understand the issue per se.
I have a question also.
Yeah.
A lot of your research and studies have been focused on physical diseases, asthma, heart disease, things like that. How much is actually being looked at in terms of mental health, the effect of the built environment?
Right there. So she's gonna come and talk to us about it. Right. And also happiness. Yes. Okay. If there's nothing else, I want to thank you for coming, and I hope to see you at our future lectures. Thank you.